The dog lay motionless on the cold pavement, ribs pressing through its matted fur. Passers-by averted their eyes, pretending not to see. But then, one pair of footsteps hesitated, a moment of fate that would change everything. The wind howled through the alley, rattling empty cans and tossing discarded newspapers like ghosts in the dark. Among the filth, a German shepherd lay motionless, its once proud frame reduced to a trembling mass of fur and bones. Every breath was a struggle, shallow and uneven. The city pulsed around it. Cars sped by, voices filled the air, but no one stopped, no one cared. The dog had once known love. There had been a time when warm hands ruffled its thick coat, when laughter echoed through the air as it chased a ball across the grass. But that was before the chain, before the beatings, before hunger gnawed at its insides like a relentless parasite. It had waited at the doorstep for days after being thrown out, convinced its owner would return. But doors never opened for creatures deemed unworthy of loyalty. Now, lying on the frozen concrete, it no longer hoped. Hunger had been its first enemy, creeping in slowly, hollowing out its ribs. Then came exhaustion, settling in its muscles, making every movement a war against gravity. And then there was the pain, deep, raw, relentless. A wound on its hind leg had festered, the infection spreading like fire through its veins. It had stopped licking it days ago. What was the point? Footsteps echoed in the distance. The dog barely lifted its head. It had learned the sound of indifference, hurried shoes clicking against pavement, never slowing, never stopping. It could still hear them now. A shuffle, a pause, and then the inevitable retreat. Even the kind-hearted had limits to their mercy. A gust of wind blew an empty food wrapper toward its paws. The dog flinched, then winced at the pain shooting through its frail body. It wasn't always this way. Once it had been strong, fierce, loyal, a protector, a friend. Now it was nothing, a piece of trash to be ignored. The world had already decided its fate. But then, something changed. The footsteps didn't continue. They stopped. Just beyond the dog's blurred vision, a shadow loomed. The dog tried to shrink away, its instincts screaming that humans meant pain. It had no strength left to run. A voice, soft yet steady, cut through the storm. "Oh God, you're still alive." The voice was unlike the others. It wasn't rushed, wasn't filled with the usual distaste people had when they stumbled upon something broken. Instead, it carried something foreign, something the dog barely remembered. Concern. The figure knelt. The scent of rain-soaked denim and something earthy, like pine or smoke, replaced the stench of garbage. A hand reached out, hesitant, cautious, as if aware that trust was a fragile thing. The dog flinched, but didn't snarl. It didn't have the energy to. The stranger didn't pull away. "It's okay," the voice whispered. "I see you." The words meant nothing, yet something in the way they were spoken sent a ripple through the dog's weary soul. The hand remained, steady, offering something the dog had long forgotten existed: patience. Minutes passed. The storm raged on. The city moved without noticing the tiny battle taking place in the filth of an alleyway. Then, warmth. Fingers touched fur, gently, barely a graze, as if afraid to cause more pain. The dog tensed, waiting for the sting of cruelty. It never came. Instead, the hand moved slowly, tracing over the sharp ridges of the dog's spine, careful not to press too hard. The stranger sighed, a sound heavy with something the dog couldn't name. Sadness. "You must have been so loved once," the voice murmured. How did it come to this? The dog didn't know. It only knew that love was a fleeting thing. The stranger shifted, removing a jacket. Without hesitation, they draped it over the dog's shivering body, shielding it from the cold. The weight was unfamiliar, but comforting. For the first time in what felt like forever, the dog closed its eyes, just for a moment. The city roared around them, indifferent as ever. But in that alley, under the soft fabric of a stranger's kindness, something changed. Hope stirred. The stranger reached into their bag, pulling out a half-eaten sandwich. The scent of meat and bread wafted through the frigid air. The dog's stomach clenched violently at the smell, a painful reminder of how long it had been since its last meal. "Here," the stranger said, tearing the food into smaller pieces. "I don't know if you can eat this, but I want to try." A hesitant moment passed. The dog's instincts screamed at it to be wary, to expect cruelty, but hunger overruled fear. Trembling, it lifted its head and took the first cautious bite. The stranger smiled, relief flickering in their eyes. "That's it," they whispered. "You're still fighting." The dog didn't understand the words, but it understood something else. The warmth in that voice, the patience in that hand, the jacket that shielded it from the biting wind. It was fragile, this moment. A single gust of wind could snuff it out. But for now, it was enough. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the dog allowed itself to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone still cared. Someone had seen it. Someone had stopped. And that small, simple act would change everything. The stranger remained kneeling beside the dog, watching as it took another hesitant bite. Each movement was slow, fragile, as if the simple act of eating required every ounce of its remaining strength. The rain continued to fall, turning the world into a blur of gray, but neither of them moved. A flicker of warmth spread through the stranger's chest, an emotion they hadn't expected: relief. They hadn't come to this alley looking for a miracle, but somehow they had found one. The dog swallowed, then looked up, its dull eyes catching the light for the briefest moment. A connection passed between them, uncertain, unspoken, but real. "You're not giving up yet," the stranger murmured. The dog didn't reply, of course. It only lowered its head, exhausted beyond measure, but something had shifted. The stranger hesitated, glancing around. This alley, this place, was no home. It was barely even shelter. The dog couldn't stay here, not like this. If they left now, it might not last the night. A decision formed, one that felt both reckless and inevitable. Carefully, the stranger moved closer, sliding their arms beneath the trembling body. The dog let out a weak whimper but didn't resist. It was too tired to fight. Lifting it was like holding a ghost. So light. Too light for something that should have been powerful, strong. The weightlessness sent a pang through the stranger's heart. As they stood, the wind howled through the alley, slicing through damp clothes and exposed skin. The dog's body barely radiated any heat at all. "We're getting out of here," the stranger whispered. "I won't let you die here." The streets were still busy despite the storm. People hurried past, heads down, lost in their own concerns. The stranger carried the dog carefully, cradling it like something fragile, something precious. Nobody stopped them. Nobody asked why they were carrying a half-dead dog through the rain. The world didn't care. But the stranger did. The apartment was small, a single-room space cluttered with books, blankets, and the remnants of a life that had never quite settled into routine. The moment they stepped inside, warmth wrapped around them, a stark contrast to the freezing world outside. Carefully, the stranger knelt, placing the dog on a soft towel near the heater. The warmth would help, but it wasn't enough. "Okay," they muttered, running a hand through their damp hair. Food, water, medicine, what else? Instinct took over. They moved quickly, filling a bowl with water and setting it beside the dog. The animal didn't react at first, its body still too weak, but after a moment, its cracked nose twitched toward the scent. "That's it," the stranger encouraged. "Just a little." The dog lapped at the water slowly, taking small sips before exhaustion claimed it again. The stranger exhaled. This was going to be a battle. They pulled out their phone, fingers hovering over the screen. A veterinarian. That was the next step. But something held them back. Money was tight. Bills piled up faster than they could handle. An emergency vet visit could cost more than they had. Still, they glanced at the dog, bones pressing through thin fur, a wound festering on its leg, the faint rise and fall of its breath. They sighed. Guess we're figuring this out together, huh? The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the city wrapped in a cold, sharp silence. The dog hadn't moved much through the night, but it was still breathing. That was enough. The stranger crouched beside it, gently stroking its fur. It flinched at first, but didn't pull away completely. "Good morning," they murmured. "Let's get you some help." They hesitated only a moment before grabbing their jacket, bundling the dog in a blanket, and heading for the door. The world outside was blinding compared to the dim safety of the apartment. The sun reflected off wet pavement, creating golden shards of light between the shadows. Step by step, they walked. And for the first time in a long time, the dog wasn't walking alone. The vet clinic smelled like antiseptic and quiet desperation. The stranger stepped inside, tightening their grip around the bundled dog, scanning the waiting area. A receptionist glanced up, eyes widening at the sight of the half-conscious animal. "Can I help? Oh God, that dog needs immediate attention." "Yeah," the stranger breathed. "I know." Minutes blurred together. A vet appeared, leading them into a back room, speaking in clipped professional tones. Words like severe malnutrition, infection risk, and critical dehydration filled the air. Is it going to make it?" the stranger asked finally. The vet sighed. "It's bad, really bad, but we'll do everything we can." The dog was taken behind closed doors. The stranger was left standing in the empty exam room, hands clenched into fists. They weren't sure how long they stood there. Time felt strange, stretched thin between hope and helplessness. Finally, the door creaked open. The vet reappeared, wiping their hands on a towel. Their face was unreadable. "It's going to be a long recovery," they said. "But the good news? Your dog is a fighter." The stranger let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. A fighter. The dog had spent so long waiting to die. But now, it was fighting. "Thank you," they whispered. The vet hesitated. "You'll need to care for it closely. Medication, careful feeding, regular checkups. This isn't a small responsibility." "I know. And the cost, I don't care," the stranger interrupted. "Just tell me what I need to do." The vet studied them for a long moment, then nodded. "All right," they said. "Let's get started." The next few weeks were a blur of slow progress. The dog was weak but stubborn. Every day it ate a little more, drank a little more. Its fur remained dull, its ribs still too sharp, but there was a new light in its eyes. A fight. The stranger spent nights sitting beside it, whispering softly, offering gentle touches that were no longer met with fear. They learned the way its ears twitched in sleep, the tiny huff of breath it made when annoyed. They learned its name, not the one it had been given before. That name was tied to a life of pain, of chains and abandonment. This was a new beginning. So, they called it Echo. Because it had survived against all odds, because its presence would never again be forgotten. And slowly, painfully, Echo began to heal. The first time Echo wagged his tail, it was barely more than a flicker. The stranger had been sitting on the floor, reading out loud, something they had done often, simply to fill the silence. They weren't even sure Echo was listening. Then, out of nowhere, thump. They froze. Echo was looking at them, his tail moving in the smallest, laziest wag. "You!" The stranger's voice cracked. "You're happy?" Echo didn't answer, but his tail thumped again. And for the first time, the stranger laughed. They had saved him. But maybe, just maybe, he was saving them too. The weeks turned into months, and Echo's transformation was nothing short of miraculous. His ribs were no longer visible beneath his thickening coat, and his once lifeless eyes now held a quiet curiosity. Each day, his steps grew steadier, his posture stronger. He had started following the stranger, his rescuer, around the small apartment, his tail wagging in lazy, content arcs. But the past wasn't so easily forgotten. One night, the stranger woke to the sound of whimpering. At first, they thought it was coming from outside, but as their groggy mind adjusted to the darkness, they realized it was Echo. He lay curled in the corner of the room, body trembling violently, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Echo?" The stranger slid off the bed, kneeling beside him. The dog flinched. It was like stepping back in time. Echo's eyes darted wildly, not seeing the warmth of the apartment, but something else, something that still lived in his mind, waiting in the shadows. His body stiffened, as if expecting a blow. The stranger's heart ached. They had worked so hard to make him feel safe. But wounds like his didn't heal overnight. Some scars never fully faded. "It's okay," they whispered, keeping their movements slow. "You're here. You're safe." Echo didn't react at first. He was trapped in whatever nightmare had its claws in him. The stranger did the only thing they could think of. They reached out, brushing their fingers gently against his fur. Echo flinched, then froze. Seconds passed. The tremors slowed. His frantic breathing evened out. His eyes refocused, grounding back in the present. The stranger didn't pull away. They let their hand rest there, offering warmth, a tether to reality. Echo let out a slow, shaky sigh, and then he leaned into them. The stranger swallowed the lump in their throat. They didn't know who had hurt him, but they knew this. Whoever they were, they had failed. Because Echo was still here, and he was loved. The next morning, the world felt a little brighter. Echo padded after the stranger as they made breakfast, his ears perked up, tail giving occasional, happy flicks. It was the small things that made the difference now. The way he pressed his nose against their hand when he wanted attention. The way he no longer cowered when they picked up a jacket or raised their voice in laughter. Trust was a slow process, but it was happening. Then everything changed. A knock at the door. The stranger's stomach twisted. They weren't expecting anyone. Echo, too, sensed something was off. His body tensed, ears flicking forward. Cautiously, the stranger moved to the door and peered through the peephole. Their blood ran cold. A man stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, impatience radiating from his posture. But it was the uniform that sent a wave of dread crashing over them. Animal control. The stranger hesitated for only a moment before unlocking the door, keeping their body positioned slightly in front of Echo. "Can I help you?" The officer, whose badge read Harrison, glanced down at his clipboard. "We received a report about a stolen dog." The stranger's heart nearly stopped. "A stolen dog?" Their voice remained steady, but their hands curled into fists. Harrison gave a tight nod. "A German shepherd, taken from a property about 6 months ago. The owner's been looking for it ever since." "Number?" "No, no, no." Echo let out a low, uneasy whine behind them. The stranger could barely breathe. They had saved him, nursed him back to health, given him a home. And now someone wanted to take him back? Number, not a chance. The stranger forced themselves to stay calm. "I think you've got the wrong dog." Harrison's expression didn't change. "Maybe, but I need to see him to confirm." The stranger hesitated. Echo pressed closer to their leg, sensing the tension. "Do you have any proof?" they asked carefully. "A microchip? Papers?" "The owner has records. If it's his dog, you'll have to give him up." A chill ran through them. Not happening. The stranger took a slow breath, then stepped aside slightly, allowing Harrison a glimpse of Echo. The dog's body remained stiff, his tail tucked tightly beneath him. Harrison studied him for a long moment, then frowned. He looks different. Of course he did. The starved, broken creature they had found in the alley was gone. Echo was still healing, but he no longer looked like the walking ghost he had once been. Harrison scratched the back of his neck. "Look, I get it," he said, his voice losing some of its authority. "You probably thought you were doing the right thing. But if this is the missing dog, we need to return him." The stranger felt their pulse hammering against their ribs. Return him. To them. To whoever had left him in that alley, starving and alone. To whoever had made him flinch at the mere sight of a raised hand. They clenched their jaw. "And if I refuse?" Harrison sighed. "Then I'll have to get a warrant." Silence. Echo, still pressed against their leg, let out a soft, uncertain whimper. The stranger knelt down, running a gentle hand along his back. "I won't let them take you," they whispered. Harrison shifted awkwardly. "Look," he said after a pause, "I'll be honest with you. This kind of thing, it happens. Sometimes dogs run away from bad homes, and sometimes they end up where they were meant to be. But I have a job to do. If this guy does belong to someone, I can't ignore it." The stranger lifted their head. There was something in Harrison's expression, something almost like understanding, and suddenly they knew what to do. "You said the owner has records," they said. "Let's see them." Harrison blinked. "What?" "If he really owned Echo, he'll have vet bills, licensing paperwork, proof of care. Not just adoption papers from years ago, real proof that he took care of him. If he has that, I'll cooperate. But if not?" The stranger's gaze hardened. "Then this dog is mine." Harrison studied them for a long time. Then he nodded. "I'll make some calls." The next 24 hours were agony. The stranger barely slept, barely ate. Echo sensed their distress, curling up beside them, pressing his weight against their side as if to say, "I'm here." The phone rang the next morning. Harrison's voice was quiet. "The owner doesn't have anything." A breath of relief. He had adoption records from when the dog was a puppy, but nothing recent. No vet visits, no shots, no food receipts. Nothing that proves he's cared for this animal in years. The stranger clenched their jaw. Of course. "So what now?" they asked. Harrison exhaled. "Legally, that means Echo is abandoned property, and in cases like that, custody goes to the person who cared for him." The stranger's chest tightened. "You mean, he's yours," Harrison said. "Officially." The stranger closed their eyes. Echo was safe. They sank down onto the floor beside him, wrapping their arms around his neck. He let out a happy, confused huff, tail wagging against the floor. They buried their face in his fur, whispering, "You're home, buddy, for good." For the first time in a long, long time, everything felt right. And Echo? He had finally found where he belonged. The relief was overwhelming, yet fleeting. Even with the legal battle won, a strange, suffocating weight settled over the stranger's chest. They had fought so hard for Echo. They had saved him. Yet, as they sat on the apartment floor, arms wrapped around his warm body, an unsettling thought crept into their mind. What if they weren't enough? Echo had survived horrors they could barely imagine. He had been abandoned, beaten, left to die in a cold alley where the world had turned its back on him. And now, he was here, safe, but still haunted by the ghosts of his past. The stranger had done everything they could to help him heal. But was love enough? Could they ever undo the damage someone else had inflicted? Echo's deep brown eyes blinked up at them, oblivious to the storm raging inside their mind. He rested his head on their lap, exhaling a slow, contented sigh. He trusted them, and that terrified them. The stranger leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. The apartment, once a place of solitude, now felt too small. The walls seemed closer, pressing in. Their whole life had changed in a matter of months. Before Echo, they had been drifting, moving through life without real direction. Work, sleep, repeat. It had been easy, in a way. No attachments, no responsibilities, no fear of losing something they loved. But then they had found him, curled up in the rain, waiting to die. And something inside them had shifted. Now, he was part of them. A bond forged in survival, in late-night whisperings, in slow steps toward trust. They had made a promise to him, and promises weren't things to be broken. Still, doubt gnawed at their ribs like hunger. They weren't perfect. They weren't experienced. What if they failed him? The thought sent a cold, sinking dread through their chest, because deep down, they knew people failed him before, and they never wanted to become one of them. That night, the stranger lay awake, listening to the soft rhythm of Echo's breathing beside the bed. Rain tapped against the window, steady, hypnotic. Memories flickered in the darkness. Echo's first day in the apartment, too weak to stand. The way his body had stiffened at every touch. The haunted look in his eyes, as if he expected kindness to be snatched away. And now, here he was. Stronger, trusting. They turned onto their side, watching him. He twitched in his sleep, paws moving slightly as if chasing something in a dream. Then, suddenly, he whimpered. The sound was soft, barely audible, but it twisted something sharp in their chest. Another nightmare. The stranger reached out, resting a gentle hand against Echo's side. "Shh," they whispered. "I'm here." Echo stirred, his breathing shifting, body relaxing beneath their touch. Slowly, his whimpers faded, his dreams settling into something quieter, something safer. The stranger swallowed past the lump in their throat. It didn't matter if they weren't perfect. It didn't matter if they were scared. What mattered was that Echo wasn't alone anymore, and neither were they. For the first time in years, they had something worth holding on to, someone who needed them. And that was enough. Days passed, then weeks. The fear that had gripped the stranger in the dead of night still lingered, but something else had begun to take its place. Resolve. Echo was healing, slowly but surely. The once frightened dog who had cowered at every sudden movement now greeted the stranger at the door, tail wagging, ears perked. He had learned the rhythms of their life, just as they had learned his. But the past had sharp edges, and it wasn't done cutting into them just yet. It happened on a quiet afternoon. The stranger had taken Echo out for a walk, something they did every day now, building his confidence in the world outside their small apartment. At first, he had been hesitant, staying close to their side, eyes darting toward every passing car. But with time, he had started to trust the world again. That day, the sun was warm, and the crisp scent of autumn filled the air. Echo walked beside them, his movements loose, relaxed. It felt almost normal. Then, the car pulled up. The stranger didn't think anything of it at first. Just another vehicle slowing at the curb, another driver checking their phone. But then the door opened, and the man stepped out. It was as if the air had been sucked from the street. Echo stopped mid-step. His entire body went rigid. The stranger followed his gaze and felt their blood turn to ice. The man was tall, broad, with a presence that reeked of dominance. There was nothing inherently alarming about him, no immediate signs of danger. But Echo knew. His tail tucked between his legs, his ears flattened. And then, worst of all, he took a step backward. The stranger had never seen him do that before. The man's eyes landed on them. Then, on Echo. "There you are," he muttered, his voice low and rough. Every muscle in the stranger's body locked up. They knew exactly who this man was. They had fought so hard to keep Echo safe, and now his past had come looking for him. The man took a step forward, reaching for Echo. "Come on, boy," he said. "Time to go home." Echo let out a low whimper, his body trembling. The stranger stepped in front of him instinctively. "He's not going anywhere with you." The man's expression darkened. "That's my dog." He was your dog." Their voice was steel now. "You abandoned him. You left him to die." The man scoffed. "He ran off." "Dogs do that." "He didn't run off. He was starving. He was hurt. You never even looked for him." The stranger felt Echo press against the back of their legs, his breath shaky, his body stiff. He wasn't just scared, he was waiting. Waiting for them to give up, waiting for them to walk away. Because that's what had always happened before. The stranger clenched their fists. Not this time. The man exhaled sharply, frustration creeping into his features. "Look, I don't have time for this. He's mine. I have papers. So unless you want to deal with the cops—" "You already lost that fight," the stranger cut in. "Animal control investigated. You had no vet records, no proof of care, nothing." The man's jaw tightened. "We went through the system," they continued. "Legally, Echo belongs to me now. You don't have a claim to him." For a long, agonizing moment, the man just stared at them. Then, his lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You think a piece of paper changes what he is?" His voice was like gravel now, rough and condescending. "He'll always remember me. He knows who his real owner is." The stranger didn't blink. "He remembers," they agreed, "but not the way you think." They took a slow, deliberate step backward, pressing their palm against Echo's side. The dog flinched at first, then hesitated. The stranger crouched down, just enough so Echo could see them, hear them. "It's okay," they whispered. "I'm here." A tremor ran through Echo's body. His breath hitched, but he didn't step back. The stranger turned their gaze back to the man. "You see," they said quietly, "dogs don't love out of obligation. They don't stay because they have to." Their fingers curled gently in Echo's fur, grounding them both. They stay when they're safe, when they're loved, when they finally have something worth staying for. For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them. Then the man scoffed. "Whatever." He turned, walking back toward his car, shaking his head. "Keep the damn mutt. He was a pain in the ass anyway." The stranger didn't move. They didn't breathe. Then the car door slammed shut. The engine roared to life. And just like that, he was gone. The moment he disappeared around the corner, Echo collapsed against the stranger's legs. Not from exhaustion, not from weakness, but because for the first time, he knew. He was finally free. Echo didn't move for a long time. The stranger ran their hand through his fur, murmuring soft reassurances, grounding him in the present. The past had reached out its claws, but it had failed. They had won. They stood there for what felt like forever, the cool autumn air wrapping around them. Eventually, Echo shifted, lifting his head. His eyes met theirs, uncertain but searching. "You're safe," they whispered. "No one's taking you away. Not ever." Echo exhaled, and then slowly he leaned forward, pressing his nose against their chest. The stranger let out a shaky breath. It wasn't just a gesture of comfort. It was trust. A trust that had been shattered once but rebuilt, piece by piece. They turned for home, moving together as one. That night, Echo lay beside them, his body warm and relaxed. There was no whimpering, no trembling, just peace. The stranger lay awake for a while, watching the steady rise and fall of his breath. The fear was still there. It might always be. But fear wasn't what defined them anymore. It wasn't what defined Echo either. He was more than his past. He was more than the scars. He had found something new, a future, a home. The stranger smiled faintly, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. Echo stirred, blinking sleepily before letting out a contented sigh, and for the first time in a long, long time, They both finally felt whole. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft golden glow over the apartment. The world outside was waking up, cars honking in the distance, the faint hum of morning conversations drifting in from the street below. But inside, it was peaceful. Echo stretched lazily on the bed beside the stranger, his large paws extending outward, his body arching in a slow, comfortable motion. It was a sight that would have been impossible months ago. Back then, every movement had been stiff, every moment tainted by the fear of the unknown. But now he was home. The stranger sat up, rubbing sleep from their eyes, glancing down at him with a soft smile. "Morning, big guy." Echo lifted his head, ears flicking forward at the sound of their voice. His tail gave a slow, sleepy wag before he let out a dramatic yawn, settling his head back down with a huff. The stranger chuckled. "Yeah, I feel that." They slid out of bed, padding toward the kitchen. Echo followed at a slow, relaxed pace, no longer the skittish, uncertain shadow he had once been. He moved with quiet confidence now, with the trust that he belonged here. As the stranger prepared breakfast, they glanced down at him. "Hungry?" Echo perked up at the word, his tail wagging faster. "That's what I thought." They scooped kibble into his bowl, watching as he trotted over and began eating. The sound of his content chewing filled the air, a simple, normal moment that felt like the most profound thing in the world. This was what they had fought for. Not just survival, not just safety, but a life. A real, full life where Echo could simply exist without fear. Later that afternoon, they took him to the park. It had become a part of their routine, something that had once been a challenge, but had turned into something Echo looked forward to. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant food stands. Children laughed in the distance, and joggers passed by with friendly nods. Echo walked beside them, his ears high, tail swaying contentedly. Every once in a while, the stranger would glance at him, just to remind themselves that this was real, that this moment wasn't borrowed time. They reached the open field, where Echo usually had his favorite part of the day: freedom. The stranger knelt beside him, unhooking his leash. "Go on, buddy." Echo hesitated for only a second. Then, with a burst of energy, he took off. Watching him run was like watching something come back to life. His legs stretched, his body moved with effortless grace, and his tail waved through the air. He was fast, so much faster than the first time they had tried this, back when he had barely had the strength to stand. The stranger watched, their hearts swelling. He was free, not just from chains or alleys or the ghosts of his past. He was free in the way that mattered, free to trust, free to love, free to simply be. Echo looped back toward them, skidding to a stop just inches away, his tongue lolling out in a happy pant. The stranger laughed, reaching out to ruffle his fur. "Show off," Echo huffed playfully, bumping his nose against their shoulder. For the first time in a long, long time, the stranger realized they weren't just surviving either. They had been lost before Echo, moving through life without purpose, without meaning. But then, on that cold, rainy night, they had seen him, and he had saved them just as much as they had saved him. That evening, they sat on the couch together, the soft hum of the television playing in the background. The stranger ran their fingers absently through Echo's fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath beneath their palm. It had been months since that night in the alley. Months since they had first knelt beside a half-starved broken creature and whispered, "I see you." And now, looking at the dog beside them, healthy, strong, whole, they realized something. They had never truly been alone. Not then. Not now. Not ever again. Because some souls are meant to find each other. And no matter how dark the road had been, they had found their way home. Together. Echo's journey wasn't just about survival. It was about resilience, about second chances, about the power of kindness. Every abandoned soul, whether human or animal, is just waiting for someone to see them, to stop, to care. What would you have done that night? Would you have kept walking? Or would you have been the one to kneel down and whisper, "I see you"? If this story moved you, share it. Leave a comment. And if you can, open your heart to those who need it most. Because sometimes, saving a life means saving your own too. Subscribe for more stories that matter.